Good morning. This lecture is on the history of the United States in the immediate aftermath of World War II. It seeks to come to terms with the tension in the United States between, on the one hand, tremendous affluence and global power the nation possessed in 1945 through really 1960, 65. And then the anxiety or the fear that this new world brought. The thesis is that America is not complacent or ignorant in the 1950s, but is very much aware of the global struggles that it faces. And it's going to pay particular attention to communism, which will be it's not the dominant theme in our class, but it's certainly a thread that goes through much of the material. Um, hint, hint, if you're interested in thinking about what exams might be on. Let me set up a slideshow here that will kind of help us work through some of the content that we need to cover. So scholars have, in the last generation, have really looked at the post-World War II period and seen that Americans have a tremendous desire for personal security. You could understand why that might be if you think about the disruptions of the war itself, with first the dropping of the bomb at Hiroshima and then the testing of the hydrogen bomb in the early period of the Cold War. And then second, think about the grave fears in America that the Great Depression might return. Remember, under the Great Depression, a quarter of Americans had been unemployed, and it seemed as if nothing the government could do would be able to return America to prosperity. So Americans in the 1950s seems like they preferred stable, large employers. They seemed less entrepreneurial, less kind of rags to riches capitalist, and more sort of willing to accept the peace that had been made between big business, big government, and labor unions. Now, that's the big theory, that Americans, in terms of the homes they created, in terms of the foreign policy they sought, in terms of the way they tried to structure their domestic politics, were searching above all for personal security. We might even talk at the end of our lecture about how that personal security might involve the world of faith. Let's focus on the events of the immediate post-war period. Now, the government had done a great deal to try to plan for peace during the war itself. So initially, the fear that the Depression would return led Americans to plan for the Servicemen's Readjustment Act in 1944, locally called the GI Bill, that would allow the 15, 16 million soldiers to get training before they return to the workforce, and that they might be trained then not just to serve as mechanics and plumbers, but as increasingly as the white-collar managers who oversee global capitalism. Now, labor didn't object to the GI Bill, but they certainly thought that they didn't appreciate how it seemed like their gains had been stalled during the war itself. And so in 1946, after the war, price controls are repealed, and there's a massive 18% rise in inflation and in prices. And so labor goes on strike in 1946 for higher standards. Over 5 million workers were on strike in that year. This is a picture of a strike from Oakland, California in 1946 from grocery store. And when the police break the picket line so that people can actually go and buy groceries, over 100,000 people in the city of Oakland strike. In response to this, Truman's very much concerned that there would be a leftist labor uprising in America. So he nationalizes the railroads and seizes the coal mines and asks Congress for a law that will allow him to draft the coal miners into the army so that they could be forced to work. This is a sense that really, the power of the presidency, even though Hitler has been defeated, that strong, vigorous presidents were seen as being necessary to defeat the enemies of America during the war. Well, after the war, things sort of keep going as they had been. There's a major constitutional case, the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, is nationalized by the federal government so that war production can continue to go on. And the Supreme Court actually strikes this down as a unnecessary act. This is not, we're not in wartime. There's no national emergency. And so Truman's attempt to kind of centralize peacetime economic power badly fails. You can see in 46, there's this anxiety of what's going to be necessary to defeat things. Now, and in fact, it proves to be dramatically unnecessary. If you think about America's commanding position in the post-war period, by 1950, the US produces 30% of global industrial. We had massive savings from the war itself. There were $136 billion that were put into savings bonds, savings accounts. There's pent up demand for spending, and so consumer spending actually goes nuts in the 45 through 50 period. Per capita income increases really dramatically during this time period. So if you look at the chart there, you see the crash during the Great Depression. It is modest, $1,200 per capita income in 1932. By the time you get to 1945, it's this doesn't work. My numbers don't work. It's $1,200 in 1945, and it's $2,200 in 1960. Now, if you put that into real GDP dollars, which is what you see there on your screen, you can see that there's a massive increase in affluence stretching from about 1940, 1946. And in the aftermath, I'm sorry, it's very early in the morning. In the aftermath, inflation erodes into that. But then it rebounds. And from 1960 to 1970, you see really dramatic sustained growth. And so Americans celebrate this. They celebrate the prosperity that they have. And they certainly aren't in the mood to question capitalism. But they're not sure how they're going to live their lives. They would agree wholeheartedly that you can't go back to the way things were before the Depression and before the war. Because to go back, you'd really have to go back before World War I. But how do you go forward? Like, what are we going to be like? What are our values going to be? And the value that they're trying to come to terms with is, what are we going to do with our affluence? Now, this is a bit of an overview, but because I want to actually, in our discussions, I want to focus on more concrete issues. But let me really quickly kind of highlight ways in which this society has some unique elements. The first is the baby boom, right? The marriage rate had been at 10.5 per thousand during the Great Depression. It jumped to 16.4 in 1945, when all of the soldiers come home and many of them get married. The birth rate goes up from 19 per thousand to 25 per thousand. So that, here's the statistic that you need. In 1957, there were 15 million Americans under the age of 15. And so these are people, these are young families, and what they most want, they crave peace, they crave normalcy, security, remember, is the word that I'm emphasizing in the lecture. They crave kind of domesticity. This is what they thought that they were fighting for. And so the domestic politics of America become pretty hotly contested. And they might mean different things in different parts of the country. Domesticity might mean a suburban house in California. It might mean in Alabama, sort of protecting the white mother from fears of miscegenation. And so like this can get quite ugly. These aren't necessarily innocuous terms. But I think generally speaking, the desire for security and family is normal after an apocalyptic war. Now, there's a sense in which Americans take their material prosperity and they spend it on trying to enjoy the good life. You see a dramatic rise in automobile manufacturing as the Ford plants stop making bombers and start making cars again. You see automobile ownership triples in America between 1945 and 1965, from 25 million cars to 75 million cars. Look at this car. I mean, it's more than just a practical transportation device. It's a status symbol. It's huge. The curves are designed to sort of sell you on a new model, which might come out later. Most of these cars are gas guzzlers. They don't get more than 10 or 12 miles a gallon. which is fine in an age of cheap oil, when America's producing more oil than anyone else in the world. By the 1960s, this is going to increasingly become a problem. Um, with then a revolution in cars, you get a revolution in the way society functions. You get the construction on Long Island, in New Jersey, in California, in Texas, these massive suburbs stretching out from major cities. And this was sort of a part of the way returning veterans would think about the good life. Um, they would, you come home from the war, and you have the ability to, with an FHA loan, buy a house that might cost $10,000 that would have a basic kind of 2-bedroom kitchen, dining room structure with a bathroom, and there might be a finished basement or an unfinished basement that you could sort of finish at your leisure. And so these were homes that people all over America felt like they could afford. And what it does, though, is it pushes young families outside of cities, and in particular outside of urban communities where they might have lived with people of their ethnicity. So imagine an Italian American family from the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Maybe then in the 1940s, they're going to move to Connecticut. They're going to move out to Long Island. And this is, they're going to then be sort of living with people their age. And this is a part of an America where ethnic divisions become a little less pronounced. Now, the exceptions generally are African Americans who are not sold these houses because they're sort of redlined within urban districts. They're called redline because generally real estate agents would have a map and there would be clear boundaries on them. Sort of look, when you came to buy a house from them, if you were Black, they would sell you a house in a particular neighborhood. They would sell you a house in what was seen as a white neighborhood. This is true even in the North. You get residential segregation. Lots of interesting scholarship on that today. Let me say a bit about William Levitt. William Levitt had been a shipbuilder during World War II. He kind of helped to, using riveting technology and using mass fabrication. He worked in a company that had been able to rapidly accelerate the pace in which cargo ships could be designed so that by the end of the war, literally the Americans are making cargo ships much faster than the Germans can sink them. And it's this sort of productive capacity of the war. And afterward, Levitt figures out, well, why can't we do this with small houses? You could sort of prefabricate large parts. You could bring them to the site. You can assemble them in place, and you can literally build these. Could build these suburbs in a matter of weeks or months. It's staggering how fast they go up. Okay, then with the creation of suburbia, you get the sort of the creation of an automobile-driven society, driven by convenience and fast food, and McDonald's might be the thing here in California, it's In-N-Out Burgers. And with that, you sort of see a revolution in retail too. Instead of kind of driving to the downtown part of your major city, you see the emergence of these shopping malls out in the suburbs, and people will drive from the cities out to suburbia. And we've since seen another revolution in sort of selling and retailing. These shopping malls are largely defunct, and it's been replaced by online. So this is a sort of sign of the way that American capitalism works. The spending is accelerating every generation, and it's the way in which consumers spend their money radically changes. So there are constant winners and losers. But you certainly see what emerged in the 1920s, which is the consumer-driven nature of the American labor force is really finalized by the 1950s. And we become a consumer-driven society rather than a producer-driven society. Now, just really quickly, I think too about all of the ways in which mass media sort of reinforces this. There's a common set. If there's a common set of radio in the 1920s, in the 1950s, there's a common set of television. Now, initially, these shows kind of celebrate blue-collar working values. So if you think about the Honeymoon, the 1940s show, this is something I don't even think is on like Nickelodeon or TV anymore. So you'd have to go to YouTube and watch old episodes. But I'm sure that many of you, at least at some point, have seen a Lucille Ball, I Love Lucy episode, right? Lucy's kind of a screwball. She plays to sort of stereotypes about what people think kind of silly housewives are going to do. But if you watch the show carefully, she's a very strong woman who is able to sort of create a media empire for herself, and she's actually a very successful businesswoman. The company that she founds later, then in the 1960s, is one of the people that sort of begin to fund Star Trek. But yeah, a very large media empire today is sort of rooted in some of the business decisions that we all make. Think too about the sameness that starts to emerge in American culture. So you're no longer sort of being driven by regional radio programs or regional sports fandoms. The TV is something that's identical all over the country, and there are three kind of major network channels, and it creates a sort of sameness in popular culture, and it creates these visions. Like, so early on, the honeymooners are an urban family, they're young, they're talking about urban blue collar life, and it's sort of an image of what you'd get from the post, the fanfare for the common man values of the 1930s. But in the 1950s, the big show becomes I Love Lucy, which is about Hollywood, and it's about, they move to suburbia and they gain all of these sort of alliances, and there's this celebration of wealth, and people watching the show sort of begin to define that as normal. That's a vision of what America looks like. That's a vision of America. Now, to the extent that there are kind of more dissenting vibes, you get it from movies and books, right? So there's this image of the sort of young rebel who's sort of disillusioned and frustrated by the conformity of society. You get this from James Dean, who sort of famously dies young. He's a sort of hero for the teen. I don't want to call him a heartthrob. This just feels wrong, but I don't know. When I was in college, there were lots of young people who were so really entranced by James Dean, right? And then Marilyn Monroe, who's this sort of different kind of symbol of womanhood, of this platinum blonde who represents a temptation to this married man who shows up in the 7-Year Itch, right? So the movies are signs that the sort of conservative family values of the 1950s are in fact not dominant in parts of culture, and that in my mind the cultural provocateurs of the 1920s are still very much working in the film industry. And if you look at the beat poets or African American literature of the 1950s, you see these strong voices of dissent. People frustrated at conformity, people frustrated at the role that African Americans have. So don't exaggerate the tone of 1950s conformity. The US is a society that actually permits significant intellectual dissent in a way that I'm not sure that the Soviet Union encouraged, right? So don't think about the difference between societies carefully. On the issue of family, this is a repeat of the point I made earlier. I should have waited until this slide to make it. The baby boom drives people out of the urban areas and into suburbia. And scholars argue, I think they're right, that family was seen as providing security and meaning and a way to sort of carry American culture forward. The best-selling book of the 1950s tells us a lot about this particular culture. And so after the Bible, right? The Bible outsells everything in it, except 1 year in the 1960s when Mao's Little Red Book outsells it. It's generally speaking always the bestseller, and so they take it off the bestseller list because it's always #1. I'm not sure if that's still true, actually, but for most of the 20th century it is. The best-selling book in the 1950s is Dr. Benjamin Spock's Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, which is fascinating to me. Think about that. What does it mean that that's a bestseller? Well, that suggests that people don't feel like they know how to raise their children because they lack authoritative religious and familial role models, right? If you live across the street from your parents, then your parents are sort of constantly in your life telling you how to raise your kids. But Spock, I mean, you don't know what you're going to do, so you're going to buy the book written by an expert. Spock urges parents to not be so strict and disciplined with children, to treat them like emotional creatures. And so critics later on will talk about baby boomers as having been coddled as children because their parents were reading Benjamin Spock. I'm not convinced of that. My mom was a baby boomer, and there's nothing about the way that I was raised would suggest to me that I was coddled. Um, we didn't we didn't have tremendous affluence, but we had plenty, and but there was still a lot of strictness. The images that we encounter when we talk about families are quite significant, right? So the social critics like to talk about how there are these diverging kind of images that start to drive families apart, that working class families are no longer driven by the same culture, right? So parents might watch a show like Leave It to Beaver with kind of cute children whose problems are all served in a 30-minute time format. And June Cleaver always sort of is in the kitchen cooking, wearing her pearls, kind of as the model of motherhood. Um, and I'm not sure that everyone sort of imagined that June Cleaver is normal, but there's a sense in which Americans sort of imagine a classless society in which families ought to look like the Cleaver family. Um, and then there's Elvis, um, who becomes a teen heartthrob and an idol by kind of taking black R&B style music, and which would have been unplayable on most white-owned radio stations, and kind of turning it into this new genre that we call rock and roll. He doesn't necessarily invent it, but he pioneers it, and so he becomes enormously popular with the young people, right? Whereas in the 1940s, people listened to the same music, and they listened to Frank Sinatra, and they listened to the Andrews Sisters. By the 1950s, by the late 50s, it's clear that teens have their own music, and they're really into rock and roll. And it's seen as sort of being socially seditious, as kind of teaching these values. Parents are really freaked out that their teenage girls are going to these concerts and that they're fainting and that they're screaming, and it's a strange thing to society. So this kind of hints at the emergence of something that's so important in the 1960s, the emergence of a generation count. Now, on faith, the 1920s we talked about as an age where American faith sort of splits into rival modernist and fundamentalist factions. And in the 1940s and 50s, you see the reemergence of a more centrist style of religion. Billy Graham, as a pioneer sort of evangelist, uses television very effectively to preach the gospel to Americans. And starting in the war and then spreading out into the 40s and 50s, he leads America into probably one of the most significant periods of revival in American history, of religious awakening, but one which is not, I think, very understood by cultural historians because they're spending so much time talking about James Dean and Allen Ginsberg and Marilyn Monroe. But in fact, church attendance in the 50s and 60s and church membership is higher than any other point in American history. Now, you'd say this about Billy Graham, he's not pushing a strong denominational vibe, right? So Americans aren't identifying as Presbyterians and Methodists and Wesleyans and Baptists anymore. They do strongly identify as Christians because they feel like that Christian identity is a key part of their fighting the communist atheists of the Cold War strategy. So I'm a little skeptical of this religiosity, in part because I see it as being intensely civil religion. To be Christian is to be American, and to be American is to be Christian. So it's not always clear to me how deep the faith goes. You see, I think most of the churches that have become really powerful are what we would have called mainline churches. So this is the sort of last gasp of Anglo-Saxon Protestant religion. But the mainline churches would be the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Congregationalists. Churches that are very much in sharp decline today are the most powerful in the 1950s. But lest we sort of exaggerate the sort of the liberal character of in theology, there's actually a pretty sharp return back toward Christ as being the center in the theology called neo-orthodoxy of Karl Barth. There's a sort of belief that liberal theology doesn't give us strong answers to the problems faced by World War I and World War II and the Holocaust and the bomb. And So we need real religion to meet the challenge of the day. So even though I think most people who called themselves Christians would have identified with these mainline churches, um, in the churches there's a return to more orthodox theology. And then the most dynamic section of American theology would have been evangelicalism, sort of led by Billy Graham. They're the fastest growing. They become widespread and of an increasing political influence. You know, the fundamentalists is sort of withdrawn from culture. Billy Graham and the evangelicals are now firmly engaging with it. You see, okay, I'm going to shift gears here and talk a little bit about the connection in politics and kind of bring us back to a conversation about communism where we'll stop. Now, politically, I think this moment does have a major parallel to the 1920s in that the war had been sort of a war for progressive causes. And so in the immediate aftermath of the war, what everyone wants is normalcy. In the midterm elections in 1946, the Republicans win back Congress. They win back the House, I believe. And using this political power, they significantly try to roll back the New Deal. They're not wildly successful, but they change the terms of American politics. They passed the Taft-Hartley Act in 1946. Taft-Hartley repeals parts of the Wagner Act, which which mandated that in order to join a union, you need, in order to, if you want to join certain factories, the union can mandate a close shop and join. And Taft-Hartley rolls that back. It allowed states to pass right-to-work laws, which today we see in probably about half of the country. And it prohibits using union dues for political activity. Truman vetoes this. He thinks this is a terrible idea. Congress overrides his veto and passes it, which is a significant. So the 1948 election was supposed to be this sort of moment of conservative ascendancy, just like 1920 was a moment of conservative ascendancy and sort of capitalism. But I think it's an underappreciated election in American history. So the Republicans nominate what they see are Republican stalwarts who are moderate, but not, they're not going to roll back the New Deal, but at the same time, they certainly don't want to go further in a progressive direction. California politicians, I think Thomas Dewey, who I believe is from New York, and then California Governor Earl Warren. Truman is clear to run again, but the Democratic Party is actually very badly divided. From the left, he faces the challenge from Henry Wallace, who had been the left-leaning president under FDR between 41 and 45. You see the emergence of a strong faction of Southerners who were upset by Truman's move towards civil rights. You know, in the aftermath of World War II, Americans decided that we fought the war for democracy. More needed to be done for African Americans. So in 1948, Truman desegregates the military. So you see a strong Southern resistance movement form. They called themselves Dixiecrats. And Strom Thurmond actually decides that he's not going to support the Democratic ticket. He runs as a South Carolinian on a third-party states' rights Democrats ticket, making it difficult. And so the Democratic Party has to decide in 48, like it wants to be a big tent, and it could certainly be a big tent on economic issues, but on this civil rights issue, Truman felt like he needed to take a stand, to signal to kind of people all over the world. Remember, in 48, India is getting its independence under the leadership of Gandhi. So Hubert Humphrey, as a senator from Minnesota, gets up and gives a fiery speech at the convention in 48, distinguishing between human rights and states' rights. And it said that the Democratic Party is not going to be the party of states' rights, it's going to be the party of human rights. And this sets up some of the segregationist battles. And it signals that maybe the Democratic Party is not quite as unified as they thought they were. So this is an election that people thought that Governor Dewey was going to win. It seems like Truman is unpopular, like he's maybe not done a great job fighting the Cold War, that he hasn't been good at protecting voters. But Truman battles aggressively, kind of arguing that we ought to have a broader healthcare plan. He hits hard on the New Deal issues. He aggressively challenges the Soviet threat. So he doesn't seem like he's a weak president internationally. And as a result, Dewey's able to be defeated. And it's not even that close of an election. You're talking about nearly 2 million votes there, which is a small but significant victory. He loses some votes in the South, but he gains votes in the North, particularly Jewish, Catholic, and African American voters, and he essentially wins middle. Truman then attempts to launch a fair deal. I won't dwell on too much, right? He wants to create the New Deal on a permanent basis, but he doesn't actually get the major parts of his legislation passed. He wants government housing programs. He wants more government spending. He wants more of a civil rights focus. So Truman is sort of leading toward democratic populism, but the Republican Party and the opposition of conservative Democrats, hard for him to accomplish this. So if you kind of think about how this looks from the Soviet Union's point of view, this is a government that, from their point of view, is leaning away from egalitarian socialism and toward a more conservative capitalism. So they treat the United States with increasing. Now, let's talk about the difficult issue. Talk about the 1950s in America, which is the issue of communism. There had been a powerful social democratic leftist party in America from the 1890s up until the 1930s. And in moments of economic downturn, communism seems like it was. In particular, remember that the Russians had sort of infiltrated American science networks and had been able to get bomb secrets from the Rosenbergs and from Oppenheimer's research ring. And Americans are deeply afraid. They're afraid of subversion. They looked at all of the ways in which Western Europe seemed to be weak against the Nazis. The way that, like in Norway, there had been Quislings who had risen up to fight for the Nazis. In France, there had been the Vichy France and Marshal Pétain, who had risen up to fight with the Nazis against the West. And yeah, Americans are terrified that this is going to happen within. And these sort of, as the government begins to crack down on communist spies, it becomes clear that there were, in fact, prominent people who had connections to the Communist Party. One of them, for example, is this young man named Alger Hiss. So Alger Hiss had been a Harvard law grad and a New Dealer. And he believed, like many other people who'd gone to the Soviet Union and seen it in the 1930s and been duped by Stalin, that the Soviet Union was sort of the wave of the future. And he's a mid-ranking official at the State Department. He'd actually been with FDR as one of his advisors in Yalta. And when people who are convicted or confessed communists name Alger Hiss as one of the secret communists in government, Americans are genuinely horrified. And the liberal elite react to Hiss by sort of defending him as one of their own. Like, this can't possibly be the case. Richard Nixon is a young congressman from California who's a war veteran. And Richard Nixon decides to make the prosecution of Hiss one of his leading kind of crusades. He gains notoriety or fame, depending on your point of view, through the House Un-American Activities Committee, where he gets Hiss to sort of say under oath that he never knew some of the communists, that it could be actually proved that he associated. The American liberal public does not believe this. Hiss is then sort of convicted of perjury, but not of being a communist, and to his deathbed he defends his innocence. Well, one of the fun things, I think, fun from my point of view as a historian, is that with the end of the Cold War and the declassification of Soviet documents, we can go into the KGB archives, and it actually turns out that Alger Hiss was in the pay of the KGB and had been feeding the documents, and it had in fact been a communist spy. So on the one hand, there are communist spies in America, and the fear seems very real. On the other hand, are the issues of McCarthyism that began to emerge in 1950s. So as Nixon, as a politician, has some success with this, you see the junior senator from Wisconsin, Senator McCarthy, decide that he's going to make a major deal. Um, Now, in 1950, McCarthy's up for re-election, I believe. He's in trouble with the voters. He doesn't have much of a record. So he decides to make the communists a major issue in the kind of upcoming event. He gives a speech to a group of Republican women in Wheeling, West Virginia, um, that blames the problems on the Cold War on traitors within. He says that the State Department is filled with bright young traitors. He waves this sort of paper and he says, I have in my hands here a list of 250 names of known communists. And the media is sort of like, wow, this is sensational. And they want to see the list. And McCarthy always makes one more accusation to sort of stay ahead of the, um, the fact that he doesn't really have much evidence, right? He's a master at using the press. The press is chasing the story. He wildly exaggerates. Um, and eventually the press starts to turn on him as someone who doesn't have a lot of complete evidence, right? So I'm kind of giving you these two clips connected to this, right? One is a clip by Edward R. Murrow, where Murrow had sort of, he's an evening news anchor at CBS News. And Murrow sort of deeply challenges McCarthy and says, you've got no evidence. So McCarthy then sort of turns the tables and accuses him. Now, the second clip, you can actually go to the American Rhetoric channel and watch the exchange on YouTube, the first televised hearings. You see this sort of back and forth between McCarthy accusing Army lawyers of being communists and like, well, who's going to have the nerve to stand up to him? If you stand up to him, you'll be accused of communism. So the McCarthyism has sort of become infamous, and this is a bit of a mess in American politics. So what happens? There's a legacy of this. That, and I want to talk about McCarthyism when we get a chance in our discussions, but the legacy of this is actually pretty significant. If you think about kind of what happens long term is that communism is sort of driven underground and destroyed in American politics. I'm not a communist. I don't especially agree for that. But what it does mean is that the left in America in the late 50s is a bit lost. It doesn't really know what it is. And so one of the challenges that you see emerge in American politics starting in the 1960s is the emergence of a new left, right? The old left had been connected to Stalin. Stalin by the late 50s has been deeply discredited, in part because of the work of dissidents, in part because the truth about communism is emerging, in part because of novelists like Alexander Solzhenitsyn that's sort of describing what life is like and how communism doesn't in fact work. So communist leaders like Khrushchev and Brezhnev felt like they need to sort of prove that it worked with concrete economic policies. So I see that as sort of the part of the domestic story in America. On the one hand, you have real kind of changes with American affluence. On the other hand, you've got deep fear of the return of poverty, and you've got fears of communism. And then you have profound transformations in American culture emerging from the baby boom and this thing that we call the generation gap. So, all right, that's all of the content I think I can cram into what's now not a very short video, but I hope that we'll have time to unpack this and discuss this when we meet again soon. All right, thanks very much. Have a good day.